of the model that deals with the product of language. So, general review of the model. So first, our brain stores a significant amount of inter-language rules, which we can access at any point. So second, all language users have the capacity to use language either in a primary or automatic, or secondary or analytical way. So third, speech in 12 is produced either automatically or analytically, and we decide whether we use the inter-language rules or not. So fourth, more 12 is produced as more discourse takes place. Hence, the more we learn, the number of new rules that are learned through dialogue.
Competition model, current approaches to second language acquisition or SLA, can be divided broadly into two groups, nativist models and empiricist models. Nativist models attribute language development to the operation of a universal, genetically controlled language instinct. For researchers in the nativist tradition, the learning of the core features of a second language involves little more than the selecting of a few switches parameters. Many nativists view second language acquisition as a recap totally the course of first language acquisition because of a strong reason of the nativist position holds that both first and second language must be actually learned. Some second language researchers who are really to grant that first language acquisition is being influenced by a universal grammar are not willing to grant that first language acquisition is strongly influenced by universal grammar, are not willing to view a second language acquisition in the same light. Competition model presents a functionalist and connectionist view of both first and second language learning that attributes development of learning and transfer rather than to the principles and parameters of universal grammar. Exploring now the competition models deals with the sum of the basic facts of both first and second language learning, and we focus on those aspects of the model that allow it to distinguish between the types of language learning. Researchers who accent nativist approaches to the first language acquisition and empiricist approaches to the second language acquisition often bolster their analysis by pointing to the evidence for a critical period for language learning. Competition model is something to the nativist and empiricist on which the idea of nativist is in the nature and other and nurture. So competition means that we can learn language through nurture or and our experience from others. Connectionism and consciousness. A starting place for consideration of the relevance of connectionist models and our concept of consciousness lies in the distinction made above between patterns of activation and the knowledge stored in connections. It is likely that patterns of activation over some brain area are associated with states of conscious experience. Thus, one may experience a friendly beagle through the pattern of white and brown blotches of its fur, the yipping sounds it makes, the excited frisking about that it does when it picks you, and this may be crucially dependent upon active patterns of activation and relevant and symbol of brain areas. One may imagine or remember an experience with a beagle by activating or such as pale, incomplete, and likely distorted versions of these patterns over the same ensemble of brain areas when the beagle is not physically present. Within the connectionist framework, it is often imagined that not all aspects of these patterns are likely to be consciously experienced. Those that are not, especially emphasized by control process and persist in a relatively stable form as structured states may, however, be more likely to be consciously experienced, both during the initial event itself and during a subsequent episode of imagination or memory. Stability of representation has been proposed as a computational correlate of consciousness by Matthews and Moser. They attractor networks and also by philosophers Brain and Alpert in their vehicle theory of phenomenal experience. The fact that connectionist models rely on knowledge stored in connection is important for the study of consciousness since it makes it clear how processing can be guided by learned knowledge without the knowledge being accessible to inspection. A central feature of explicit representation is that one is, at least potentially, conscious of having them. Knowledge is thus always implicit in what Clark and Karmelov Smith dubbed first-order connectionist networks. In contrast, knowledge in classical symbolic systems all seem to be at least potentially explicit, to the extent that is stored in a format or symbolic propositions that makes it impossible for it to influence behavior, that is to have causal powers, without being accessed or manipulated by an agent, that is the processor. In other words, information processing in classical system always appears to entail access to stored representations in a way that is strikingly different from what happens in connectionist networks. According to O'Reilly and Monacata, activation-based processing is based on the activation, maintenance, and updating of active representations to influence processing, whereas weight-based processing is based on the updation of weight values to alter input and output patterns. The main advantage of activation-based processing is that it is faster and more flexible than weight-based process. Speed and flexibility are both salient characteristics of high-level cognition. Representation can take two very different forms in connectionist networks, neither of which corresponds to classical propositional representations. One form of representation is the pattern of activation over the units in the network. Such patterns of activations are generally thought to constitute the representation one has of something while perceiving, processing, or remembering it. Networks that employ such units for all cognizable entities of interest are called localist networks. The representation of an item is in sense localized to the single unit that stands for it. Most networks, however, rely on distributed representation, the idea that an item such as a word, object, or memory is instantiated by pattern of activation over a large ensemble of units. Connection ways are generally assumed to be completely inaccessible to any form of inspection. They can and do, however, encode associative relationships between arbitrary patterns, such as the association between a name and a face, and structure or local mappings between patterns, such as the relationship between the present tense form of a word and its past tense, or the feature shared by an ensemble of patterns in an implicit learning experiment. Another important feature of connectionist system is the fact that the patterns of activation that are formed during processing are not subsequently stored in the system as memories. Instead, they are thought of as leaving a trace in the network through the adjustments they produce in the connection ways. These adjustments can then allow the pattern or something like it to be reconstructed at a later time. As a form of memory, thus long-term knowledge in connectionist networks is always encoded by the connection ways, whereas the temporary results of processing occurs through activation patterns over units. Processing in connectionist networks occurs through the propagation of activation signals among the processing units via the weighted connections. The process is generally regarded as a continuous time process subject to random variability. Thus, it is widely assumed that the state of activation of units evolves continuously over time and is not completely deterministic, so that the same input can give rise to different real-time trajectories, while in reality, much of our experience consists of a fairly continuous flow, that is a visual or auditory experience. Many connectionist networks settle over time after the presentation of an input into what is called an attractor state or attractor networks. A stable pattern or activity that tends to remain in a place until some sort of receipt occurs so that the next input can be presented. Such attractor states may be seen perhaps as representing the sequence of a state a perceiver might enter into while making fixations on different points in static state, or experiencing a set of discrete items presented one after another in sequence. This process is often further simplified as a simple one-pass feed-forward process that allows the pattern of activation over a set of input units. together perhaps with an internal pattern left over from the last round of settling, to influence the next state of the network. Networks of this type, known as simple recurrent networks, have many of the essential properties of PDP models, and so have been a subject of fairly intensive study, particularly in the domains of language processing and implicit learning. Learning in connectionist models is the process of connection weight adjustment. In contrast to traditional models in cognitive science, most connectionist models learn through experience. This is through repeated exposure to stimuli from the environment. Two broad classes of learning mechanisms can be distinguished based on whether adjustments to the connection weights are dependent on an error signal or not. In the former case, learning is said to be supervised where it is driven by the difference between the ground response of the network and a target response specified by the network. Such supervised learning, that is the backpropagation, instantiates the computational objective of mastering specific input-output mappings, that is, achieving specific goals, in the context of performing specific tasks. By contrast, unsupervised learning, that is, Hebbian learning, instantiates the different computational objective of capturing the correlational structure of the stimulus environment, so enabling the cognition system to develop useful, informative models of the world. Unsupervised learning procedures do not depend on the availability of a teacher signal, but instead determine adjustments to the connection ways based on the stimulus distribution of connected neurons. So, instantiating the notion that neurons that fire together wire together. The same principle that is also observed in the neural process of long-term potentiation.